Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 175. Today I'm sharing a profoundly personal and precious episode, and I feel really moved to be sharing it with you today. It's special because I'm talking with a dear family friend, Kate Skinner, who had an incredible impact on this world and passed away this week. Kate's family and my family have been totally intertwined since long before I was born. My parents and Kate and her husband Jimmy spent their young adulthoods side by side. Kate was my mum's best friend throughout nearly 60 years of friendship. Living together at times, raising children at the same time, Kate's daughter Kelly has been my dear friend through childhood and then in adulthood. We lived together too when we were young adults, and our two families have shared countless birthdays, celebrations, parties, gigs, book clubs, trivia nights, picnics, sleepovers, weddings and funerals and births. All the joys as well as all the tough stuff of life. This extra special episode was recorded in Kate's bedroom, sitting on the bed using lapel microphones. I'd never used them before, and I had no idea what I was doing. At the start of this episode, you'll hear a small section where I was fumbling with the technology and trying to get it right. And when I was editing this episode, I left this section of the recording in the final edit because every part of this exchange is so tender and full of love, and I thought you might like to hear it too. In the episode, you'll hear all the noises of suburban Brisbane in summer, sounds of sirens and cicadas and the dogs' paws clacking on the wooden floorboards and birds outside. And I love these noises. They're the sounds of Kate's home. And it was important for me to leave these sounds in the final episode as well. Somewhere towards the middle of our chat, the tone of the conversation changed a little. In the beginning, we were talking about Kate's story of growing up in New Zealand and becoming a teacher and her passion for social justice and literature. And then at some point in the conversation, it turns quieter and more reflective as we talk about life and fear and the importance of connection and what it is to be human in this world. We don't have answers to these big questions, of course, but it's so special to chat about these deep things together. It's hard for me to know what to say in this introduction because this loss is so profound. But I'm really happy to share this conversation with you so that you can know Kate and see what a shining light she was in this world for everyone who was lucky enough to be in her life. Let's listen. Okay, so the red light means it's recording. So
we are on.
We're rolling, but let's just do it and see what happens.
Yes, although your red light just went off. No, sorry, it's not. It's right.
Okay,
it just went around the corner. Pleasant sort of thing.
I feel weirdly nervous. I don't know why.
Well, you were saying before you don't normally have your person necessarily in front of you, so that is something that's a little bit. Something that's a little bit different.
Yeah, I think it is, and I have like this sense that I just want to get it right.
Yeah.
Because I love you.
Oh, I love you too. I know. I've been thinking about it, and even though for quite a short time, only a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
It's been really, a very intense sort of thinking about it. Everything I've been reading and looking at, I've been sort of thinking and
through that lens.
Through that lens, yes. Yeah. So,
and there's so much to say, and. Anyway,
There's so many ways to say it.
Yeah, there's
that's
so many ways to say it.
How you actually cover it from all angles, yes.
And later on today, you'll think of like, oh, I could have, should have said that. And that's also part of it, and that's fine.
Yeah. I know you feel like, oh, I want to do it again.
Yeah. Okay. All right, shall we start?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sounds great.
Kate, here I am sitting on your bed and gazing at you, and I love you, and I'm so glad that we're here together to do this podcast. Thank you for being here.
That's a pleasure. It's exciting to share this with you.
Yeah. Well, you are so much a part of me. You're my other mother, really.
Yes.
And I was reflecting today how beautiful it is to have, you just so much a part of my history and all my memories. I think this house is probably the first place I stayed.
Yes.
Stayed the night
at. Did an overnighter act.
Yeah, did an overnighter. And to have you as that person, like literally second mum.
Yeah.
And then just as my relationship with my mum changed when I grew up and we became friends.
Yes.
You and I have done that as well.
I know. It's quite unusual in a way, I think. We're kind of like, yes, we've sort of mother-daughters travelled along, but we've sort of come across somehow and developed our own friendship and thing that's still part of the togetherness of the all of us, but is also separate. We've developed that,
and so many memories of just like passionate discussions about literature and about life and what it is to be human. And
book clubs.
We will get to that.
Children.
Yep. Well, let's go back because I want to hear about nature in your childhood, as it's a place I always start with the podcast. And I'd love to hear about nature in New Zealand, and then we'll talk about sort of the arc of nature in your other experiences as you grew up, as you developed as a person and became a mum and all that stuff. But let's start with nature in New Zealand.
New Zealand. Well, I guess I was born in the early 1950s, 1951, in New Zealand in the South Island in Dunedin, and so I spent the first 10 years of my life in New Zealand. And I think I feel very grateful to have grown up in those decades where, the 1950s, I experienced just such freedom to be outside and there were no fears really. We didn't even have television. So we were just outside the whole time. That was what we did. Or we were perhaps reading or playing games, but very much an outdoors life at that time without a lot of distractions, certainly. So it was, so it's a very special time. And then I was just sort of lucky. The 60s was like a revolution in terms of culturally, women's liberation, sexually, all of that. And it went through that whole period. And in the 70s, having babies in a very alternative time. So I feel very lucky to have covered those sort of decades the way that I did. But coming back to the 1950s, so really, my first few years were spent on the west coast of New Zealand, and I certainly have very few memories, really, probably of that time. But one overwhelming one is that there was still a whaling on the west coast of New Zealand at that time, and I can remember going into town, and there would be a huge whale strung up at the edge of the sort of jetty. It was all very primitive, really. There were big pots of but I have this vision, sort of like almost pre-industrialization kind of this huge animal, which was dead, but being sort of cut down or whatever they used to do to it. And that's sort of like, I certainly think, and I've just had a love for whales all my life, and whales have been very important. Whales and elephants, actually, to me, big animals. So that was just sort of an early memory of sort of something of to do with nature, but in a kind of quite a weird sort of way. But we moved to Christchurch when I went to school, and we were lucky. My father was a minister, and we lived in a big church in the middle of town, one of the biggest churches, and we did have a gardener, which made life easier for my parents. But we had the most magnificent garden.
Really?
And it was just full of fruit trees and bushes and things you don't even see here, like, gooseberries. We would have little scissors and we'd be out, we'd call it top and tailing the gooseberries.
You were helping the garden?
Yes. We spent a lot of time in the garden and climbing trees. There were apricot trees, nectarine trees. It was every stone fruit you could imagine. Walnuts. We had all these, I can just still see little walnut clippers hanging over the branches that we would leave up there to go and sit up there and crush walnuts and eat. So we had a very out in the garden, and we had huts out there, and we made houses and all sorts of things. So we lived a lot out in the garden making things. My dad was a beekeeper, so we had bees in the garden as well, and chickens, as well as, I just think every vegetable or fruit really that you can almost imagine. So it was a very busy sort of garden, and I was very involved in it. So, and even though, I wouldn't say I was aware of nature journaling as such, already I was developing those skills of looking very carefully, because when you're picking fruit to eat or taking a lot of notice and awareness of veggies and fruit, you are looking at detail, you are looking at lines on them, you are looking at colouring of them and where they are at their stages of maturation. So you are taking in a lot of detail, even though at this stage I wasn't obviously, necessarily writing that down. But I think I drew a lot. So lots of freedom being out. We had a creek not very far with great big willows hanging down, the big hanging willows, like the English willows that we made swings out of and plaited together, and spent hours and hours playing down there, making little canoes and all sorts of things. So no, I was very fortunate to have that kind of experience when I was very young. I've just been so close to nature and enjoying it, and being able to live that kind of just have that kind of freedom.
Freedom is a word that you've said a few times, and that's such an important part of childhood, I think. And I think that freedom comes from unstructured outdoor play. And it sounds like you had that in abundance.
Absolutely.
Just going out and wandering around.
And riding bikes. We often had our bikes. And Mum would sort of we'd sort of set off. It was a bit like, Enid Blyton in a way. We sort of set off in the morning with our something. Not necessarily lashings of ginger beer. But we'd set off in the morning.
Like a little picnic or something.
We'd definitely have fruit, and just taken from the garden as we sort of went. And sort of, then we would sort of, and because it's quite a way down in the southern hemisphere, it didn't get dark till quite late. So we were out, for hours and hours and hours. And Mum, I don't think, really never knew really where we were.
That was just
but there just wasn't
part of it.
Yeah.
I remember from my own childhood, because we grew up, as you know, in the suburbs, Indooroopilly suburbs around here, and it was very suburban, but we had a lot of fruit trees in our backyard too. And I remember being up trees, but I remember, like you say, it wasn't nature journaling, but there was some intensity in childhood, isn't there?
Yes.
And you're discovering new things. And I do remember there's a few things that I remember that were the same feeling as I get when I'm nature journaling, which is like that utter surprise at something you've seen. Delight at I remember Mum made like me, she used to get inspired to do the veggie garden at certain points, and then that inspiration might wane. But I remember in one of those inspiration points, she dug up the garden, and we had this little corner of it. She was planting veggies, but one part of it was that she gave us a packet of snapdragons. And we planted the snapdragons. And then I remember them coming up and turning into snapdragons, and that utter amazement. And it sounds like you had that with the fruit trees and the fruit. Like just those points of just utter amazement.
Because they would all be seeding and dropping seeds, and we would be replanting and things like that. And it is an absolute amazement, and it does take you into a whole another realm of spirituality as well when you're young, that you are actually, who is responsible for this? Who is creating this? What is the forces that are, So there are so many layers involved when you can spend that time and have that kind of freedom to be able to explore nature like that.
And your family, your father had mentioned spirituality, but your father was a minister, and he had this amazing love of nature and humans and just life, really. I'd love to hear you talk about how the things that you picked up from him, how he loved the world, and how that sort of came down to you.
Yes. He wasn't your normal minister. We weren't sort of dressed up and sent off to church on Sundays or anything like that. So So he was quite unusual in many ways, and he had more Buddhist sort of leanings, which obviously respect for beings or living beings was very, very strongly in the forefront of his mind. But also he saw sort of Jesus as a role model. He wasn't really interested in the kind of academics of perhaps the Holy Trinity or whatever. He was much more interested in being practical and helping people and making connections and doing, things with people that were helpful. So he was quite an unusual. He'd be round all the time, chopping wood for people. He started a newspaper in the little town that we were previously to Christchurch. He gave, he had honey workshops. He started workshops for education for young people and all sorts of things that he was just very much into social justice and things being equal. And at that time in New Zealand, there was a lot of disparity because, we were originally this wasn't a coal mining town where there were wealthy people who owned land and mines and what have you, and a lot of workers who didn't have many rights. So he was very much, on the side of the workers, and their rights and making sure that they were treated well. So yes, he was an unusual person, and with all of that, he absolutely loved trees, bees, nature, his garden, and always was involved with other people. I mean, I can see him coming in the back door with big swathes of sort of silver beet or whatever it would be, because everyone bartered. Who had those sorts of gardens back then, which was another part of that lovely generosity of nature as well. But there's always usually more than enough, and that sharing is really kind of an important part of it. Yeah.
And I mean, you, for as long as I've known you, which is my whole life, social justice has been so much a part of who you are as well. So you gathered that through your father and
definitely.
your family.
And later on in his career, he actually left the church and worked for the Australian and the World Council of Churches, and worked with refugees, particularly in Southeast Asia in the 60s, the 50s and 60s. And later. But he was a demonstrator. He was out demonstrating for the Springbok tours for against apartheid and things like that. He wasn't afraid at all of being
standing
heard
up and saying what's right.
Seen. Yeah.
And so the next part of your story, you came to Australia. You spent some time in Asia because of your father's
his work
with refugees.
Yes.
I'd love to hear a little about that.
Well, yes, that was a really interesting time. That was really between just when I left primary school. So maybe I'm not that great on dates, but I was probably about 11 and 12. So they sort of almost took a year out at that time from my schooling, and I travelled with them to the Philippines, to Japan, to Hong Kong. Most of it spent in Hong Kong, really, and that was where Dad was helping refugees coming out of communist China at that time, swimming over the Pearl River into Macau there.
That's incredible.
They'd come into that. There's a huge big Catholic cathedral in Macau that was very famous for a refuge sanctuary, and he worked there helping people, getting papers and being able to move them on into camps or other countries, finding a safe place. So he was always involved in that, and that was a very interesting time, and very different cultural experiences. And I was thinking about it the other day, because I was thinking about, say, with nature, with that, which perhaps because when we were in Hong Kong, we were actually living on I think the 12th floor of the YMCA or something, right near the Star Ferry terminal. But when we were in Japan, we were actually staying in monasteries in a lot of different places and staying with church sort of people. There weren't many Christian churches, so we were very much with Buddhists or Zen Buddhists or the Shinto people. And Dad was one of these people that could move across religions, so it didn't worry him. He didn't have this idea that anything was sort of compartmentalized into religions. He was just, we're all in this together. So, and we did stay at a wonderful monastery in Kyoto, particularly, where every morning, and I have a very strong memory of this, the monks got up very, very early, and they there's a big stone garden. It's called Ryoanji, and big stone garden with stones sticking up, which comes to me, I'll come back to that in a minute. We're thinking about Italy and gardens, but every morning they rake the stones in a different way, and they take hours doing it. And the patterns there were mandalas and all sorts of things, and the meditation that goes with it. And there were little wooden things you could go and sit and watch them doing it, and it became a meditation. Obviously, people came there to meditate as well, and it was a very strong, natural sort of thing of just watching patterns in stones and dirt just becomes something really beautiful.
Wow.
And that detail again of just and using these very primitive sort of wooden rakes. Yeah, what has really stayed with me. I can think of that. Yeah, quite. That visual is quite strong. Yeah.
What was your understanding, having your father as a religious leader, but also then having exposure to all these other ways of viewing spirituality?
Yeah.
What was your understanding of spirituality at that time? Do you remember?
No, just totally accepting, I think. Yeah. I didn't really sort of think about it. I just thought they were Zen monks and they were wonderful, and they were something else and they were wonderful. I don't think that I really, I just was very accepting of it all. Yeah, as was the people that obviously I was mixing with as well. So, yeah, I don't think I necessarily sort of did differentiate a lot.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a sense of your own personal spirituality?
I think so. Yeah, which was very similarly shaped, by my dad. Yeah. But just that, I just, Jesus Christ was the greatest. Not at this stage we were thinking about hippies, but, was the greatest sort of like alternative hippie that ever lived.
Yeah.
And loved everyone. It was just about love my brother and do unto others as you will do as you would have them do unto you. That was very strongly, obviously, mantras and guides for being,
That's beautiful. Yeah. And so the next stage is you developing to become a teacher, going to high school, going to university.
In Sydney.
In Sydney. Yeah. Did you know that you wanted to be a teacher right from the start? When did you know?
No, not right from the start, because I did fiddle around with my first semester at university. I think New South Wales University had just started an arts law thing, and I did sort of enrol in some law which were terribly boring, like torts 1 and 2, which were just rote sort of learning of, and but I didn't ever pursue that. But initially, I must have had that idea that perhaps I would have something to do with social justice law. But no, once I actually got to uni, I sort of got involved in, because my other subjects were English and history. Mm-hmm. Once I got involved in that fell away actually, but still not completely, because it still was very much part of the framework that I worked in. Or thought in. But literature became my really big love. And writing and reading.
Yeah. And you taught for 40 years in your career. But you were lucky enough to have a chance to do it your way. And I would love to hear about that, because curriculum can sometimes constrain teachers. But you just fell into a school, but also you were lucky enough to be able to go your own way and develop your own.
I really flew under the radar and sort of could do because I actually, even though I had this incredible love for education, I also disagreed with a lot of the ways it was taught, which I thought just was so sad, because it sort of killed the subject in many ways. And going back, just even if I go back to my childhood a little bit more, reading was a huge part of it. I was always reading. So that was very, very important to me. So I think that I wanted to imbue the kids or my students with this absolute love of exploration of a whole other world that opened you up to have just so many different experiences and be in another world. And discover more about yourself, that sort of thing. So I really felt very strongly about joy in learning, and joy in reading, and joy in still analysing literature, still looking at meanings, looking at the aesthetics of writing, like the use of metaphors and the use of similes and the use of all those poetic devices which just bring writing to life, to make it just a lot of fun and a lot of joy, and talk about books a lot. We used to the kids used to bring in books and we'd talk about reading. And I did not, I would have to say I did not follow the curriculum very well. I'm sure we covered things pretty well, but I wasn't one to be looking up documents and be thinking, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. I went on, as it unfolded, we sort of followed. And that led to, in grade 11 and 12, they brought literature in a couple of years ago as an ATAR subject, and I taught that for 4 years. And I absolutely loved it. And it was a little less restricted than the English program, than the English curriculum for ATAR, for the general English one. So I had other books and novels or whatever texts I liked to choose from, which were a little bit more interesting, maybe demanding, unusual African literature. We started to bring in a lot more sort of international sort of sources as well, which was really good to see. Some wonderful African literature we studied, and Indigenous, which hadn't really, people like Alexis Wright, which was just the most wonderful experiences with her writing as well.
Tell me about her writing.
Well, she wrote this wonderful book that we studied in our first year of literature called Carpentaria, which was set up in the Gulf country, the Gulf of Carpentaria, Normanton and places like that. But she's just got such a sort of sense of humour in a way that there were two sort of mobs that were sort of had a lot of problems with each other, so it wasn't a sugar-coated sort of book at all, and two families that ruled those mobs, and there was a lot of very strong and intense feelings between them, but of course actually love. It's a bit of a Romeo and Juliet story in a way. It's also reminded me of there are always all these links. It was a bit like the pickles and the lambs in Cloud Street. There are lots of kind of links that you can think about that are sort of interesting and can go right back to Shakespeare like that. So she was a wonderful writer and just brought that area. We're talking about landscapes particularly too, which is such a large part of writing. The landscape of that and the weather and the culture of that country up there, with water particularly, and it does very much. It's about water and air. It's about those elements that are very important to the Indigenous people. It was just wonderful, and it just opened a world to the students. And
how did the kids respond?
Oh, they loved it. Yeah. I mean, there were always a few that would take a little while to engage, but you could really with all of them, and they were small classes, which is always a nice thing to have. Yeah. But you'd see that they'd suddenly. Something there'd be something in it for everybody, I had one boy in it, and I wouldn't say he engaged immediately, but Norm, who's one of the guys, he's a great boatman, and the stars are really, really important to him, and the tides and the what. So, but I had him a boy in the class who was really into fishing and tides and things like that, so he had some way to go in under the text and sort of like engage with it, because it's just something really beautifully dealt with and quite succinctly, but something sort of there for so many people and so many different sorts of readers. So and the Indigenous way of writing, there was it wasn't following time it was following it more cyclically, and so that's another way of looking at at the world as well.
Absolutely. When you were speaking, I was thinking about reading and. You can read a book and just get through it, or you said something, I can't remember the words used, but you said he sort of dive under it into it, like diving into a wave or something. Yes. And when you submerge yourself into a text, you receive it in a different way, like you're receiving it through your pores or something. I don't know how to explain that.
I know, and it involves a passion. It's something that is quite hard to sort of explain, but it is absolutely a viscerally sensual experience.
It is. Yeah. And maybe it goes back to like the same devices that we use in nature journaling, which is paying attention, being open, being curious.
Absolutely.
You can read like that. You can read almost with your whole body, your whole focus, your whole attention.
Yes, absolutely. Because what we did in that class too, one of the first sorts of exercises I would do, and I do them intermittently so that we just sort of kept up with that awareness, was that I'd say to the kids, we had quite a big playground at the school that I was teaching at, and I'd say, go outside and just find anything you like that takes your fancy, but something that you sort of engage with when you see it, perhaps a pine cone, perhaps a particular just beautiful big dried leaf or something like that. And you can bring it back into the classroom, or you can sit under the tree. And we started drawing, and that's how we sorted there. And then we started to look at sort of the detail in there, that the lines of how maybe the lines, the veins in the leaf, or the way it curled, or the way the pine cone, maybe the seeds were just almost ready to sort of take off, sort of on the cusp. So just getting those sorts of details and thoughts about it, and then we sort of went to the next stage. It wasn't quite like that, but I'd say now start writing, start doing your description, start thinking it looks like or it feels like, and making it into a real sort of sensual experience as well, about how it even feels. So that's how we sort of started. And I was very influenced by you. I mean, that's how I kind of knew to direct those lessons. And I ended up, and then they were just, they loved it. Yeah. And they'd often come in and say, "Oh, Miss, can we go out and draw and write?" And I'd like lots of lessons. And I'd say, "Yep, that's fine." And they learned to really, as you just said before, to focus and to be aware and to look and suddenly see, sometimes they'd see something, a little nodule or something that was a different colour and it was beautiful. And they were so excited. It was just so nice to see that kind of bubbling up of sort of feelings about something so
that's what it
natural and normal, like a leaf on the ground. And they started to see it as something quite special, which of course nature is, but we often just don't see it.
It's just those things that you can pass over in a normal day, or you can pay attention to. And it's the same. I'm thinking about, so we used to have a book club.
Yep.
You and I and my mum, your daughter Kelly, and our friends.
Yes.
And we did that for some years, didn't we?
We did.
And we read books, but
we read some classics.
We read classics. We read other things. Yeah. But, having an English teacher in your book club is very useful, because going to a movie with you or reading a book with you, you notice things that not everyone did. Yeah. And often you would bring up little things that you'd notice. Yeah. And again, it's about paying attention and noticing things. Yeah. And you would notice these tiny, subtle things that actually were very deep and pivotal to the story and the understanding of the story. Yes. Yeah. It was an absolute joy to discuss these books with you. Yeah. And a lot of them actually were heavily influenced by landscape. Yes. I'm thinking one of them was Wuthering Heights, which is so totally immersed in landscape. Okay.
Absolutely.
And the other one that comes to mind is The Grapes of Wrath. Yeah. Which was, again, just it is the landscape, isn't it? Yes.
John Steinbeck actually says, just a little phrase from the book, is the aridness of their life.
Oh, yeah.
And you just think, because here's the Jodes, the family, travelling across. It's a desert bowl with nothing.
Yes.
Looking for just a spark of life, food, sustenance in some way. Yeah. And it's that aridness, that word, just is so, and it's of their life, not just
the landscape.
Not just the landscape, but it's reflected in their whole characters.
Yeah, yeah.
And why the ending, of course, with the feet, when Rose offers her breast milk as a sort of sign of hope and that life can go on. There is something in the human condition that does, keep us going. It's so beautiful. And it's all she had to give, because there was nothing else because of that dryness,
Oh gosh, I've got goosebumps right now. This book I've read again and again, and The Grapes of Wrath ending is like the most moving book. I remember, they say it in cartoons or in movies or something, that their jaw dropped open, but my jaw literally dropped open at that ending.
Yes.
because exactly what you say, they just had so much aridness in the landscape, in their lives, just hopeless, barren, dry, desolate, like no future, and yet all that she had to give, she gave, and she smiled at the end.
That's mysterious smile.
Like a Mona Lisa smile almost.
Which is a little bit ambiguous, a little bit, but beautiful. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, it's wonderful, and it's still so relevant. You can still read, a book like that today, which was set in 1929, I think. You can still read that book today. There are still migrant workers on the go all over the world, really. Trying to find something, find this oasis, find this life.
Find a little glimmer of hope or something to hold on to.
Absolutely. And it's still, it's just been going on forever, and it's still going on, and it's just so, But, that dust bowl, you can still sort of feel it in your bones and in your skin when you've read that book. It's just so...
absolutely. Yeah. And also that... just the matching of the story and the landscape in such a beautiful reflection of each other. And that, again, going back to the other one, one of the others was Wuthering Heights, which is like the landscape, the North Yorkshire moors, just utterly wild and windy and stormy and dark. And
thorny bushes and rocky, pointy stones and great big stone building with, just so... medieval almost, but also just so cold and
and how that matches with Heathcliff's personality and how he's just so stormy.
The storms, absolutely, and unpredictability of the landscape, the weather, and everything that happened. Was just matched the tempers or the traits and characters of Catherine and Heathcliff, and it's wonderfully done. It's wonderfully represented in that book. Even in the two houses, you've got Wuthering Heights, which is this huge stone house on a hill, sort of surrounded by, I think she's called wind-bent trees and things like that, really been affected by the weather. And then you've got Thrushcross Grange down in the valley, which is all sort of sunny and what have you. And so even within a setting, which is the moors or the geographical setting, you still have this little microcosm of the houses being also another setting
and
that
how
actually
that
influences
the inhabitants of those houses.
Influences them, the people that live in those houses, and the reader as well. So it's lovely that's that kind of layering that you get as well in representation. So I think that wonderful, obviously writing in both of those writers that really show, because when you think about it, that connection with the landscape. We're like characters, just as people, are shaped by their landscape, just as what we've talked about this morning too. But you're not born into a vacuum. You are born into a culture, and you are born into, we were talking to before the podcast even about the sort of food that's grown in a landscape and how that affects also, obviously, the way that we respond to that landscape and what we eat from it, and the culinary sort of aspects of it.
Absolutely. And that I know you've travelled a lot in Western Europe, in England and France and Spain, and those places are so steeped in the landscape, or the culture and the landscape are one thing. Going there and seeing, for me, it was seeing the wild herbs in France, in southern France, and just that's picking wild herbs, picking wild mushrooms is so much a part of culture. And that also seeps into literature and the way people experience the world.
Absolutely. Their sustenance. Yes. And just going back to, I know I'm jumping a little bit, but going over, when I spent a couple of years ago, a couple of weeks in one town actually, in Tivoli, not very far out of Rome, and there are two very famous gardens there called Villa de Et, and also one that was Hadrian's something, I'm not quite sure what the last word was. But anyway, they are World Heritage UNESCO sort of gardens, and they use, thinking about even going back to Japan where they use the rocks in the garden, these gardens, art is such a part of the garden. It's not just trees. Nature is also art. and beauty, and that's really an important part of it. And these gardens that were built in the 16th century had beautiful fountains, but no pumps were used at all. And you just think the engineering sort of feats in these, they actually use music and rhythms and times on some of the fountains as well. And you just think that's just so amazing. All those centuries ago, that these beautiful gardens, and they were the trees and the nature and the plants and everything, which is so superb. But it was also about beauty and about art.
Yeah. What do you think that is in the human nature? Because even way back, I mean, there's cave paintings, and I don't know if they're for imparting information about hunting or whatever it was, but I think that there was an element of beauty, or needing to capture beauty.
Yes.
What is it about the humans that we need beauty? Like even through COVID, people were leaning so heavily on nature and art at that time, because we're in the bare bones of it, you know, and those were the things that sustain people.
That's right. I know, it's still so important.
I love that you brought up the word beauty, because I think that paying attention, noticing these things, there's something that nourishes us as humans.
Absolutely. And in this day and age, unfortunately, when where we are, a lot of people are suffering from mental health issues and from depression and things like that. I think it's just so important, and it's so hard though, to also learn about reframing things, about seeing positives and gratitude and things like that. And I think that reading is one of the greatest doorways or gateways into being able to kind of unravel some of that. Reading about other people's experiences, writing about your own experiences, which is journaling, noticing, just, being able to go for a walk and actually be looking and being aware. All of those things are just so important. To sort of get into sort of habits that are helpful to look at the positives in life. And it is about beauty. It is about realising we live on such a jolly, beautiful planet. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's it. Like, we have this one little blip of time for us to experience it. And we can pay attention, or we can just wander through and not realise how precious this is.
Yes.
I'm just going to wait for Ziggy. Ziggy!
Coming back to that point, I'm just reading a book called Orbital, which won the Booker Prize, 2024, which is it's a little novella actually, beautifully written by Samantha Harvey, and it's actually the story of 7 astronauts who are on the International Space Station, who are spinning around the world, and they're all from different countries. So there's a lot of cultural sort of things going on, and absolutely beautiful. But they are in this absolute unique position where they are separated from nature, really, in as much as they're looking down on the world.
Gosh, that must be a wild
or on planet Earth, and through sort of a glass window. But they spend hours and hours and hours at that glass window, and the writing about just the colours that they see, and as the continents sweep by, and the weather is very, very strongly, because there's typhoons forming, or there's things forming around the globe, and it's just absolutely fascinating the beauty that they find in this particular disconnection in a way, but albeit really strong connection. And they also link it to, there's a Japanese girl in it, and she really, she uses the metaphor, actually, her mother grew pumpkins, and her mother dies while she's on this mission, which is really sad, but she has this sort of thing of the pumpkins, visions of the pumpkin sort of drying out and becoming almost like paper, like a mother, sort of like, beautifully written, but it's just interesting that they're not touching, or they're not able to be out in nature as such, but they also totally are. In this quite odd way, or unique way.
This is bringing up a memory for me. I remember being in science class in year 8, I think. And we were doing something about space, and they showed pictures of the Earth from space, and I just remember maybe that was the first time I'd really deeply contemplated that we are on this little marble, like the tiniest speck of the corner of the universe that's expanding.
Yes.
And I just remember seeing those pictures and I had some really deep experience or like a sense of, oh yeah, like we're just minuscule, and our planet is so rare. Like we've never seen anything else like it in all the space exploration.
That replicates what we have.
Just the right pressure and temperature and atmosphere to have life and water and air. All the right
uniqueness.
conditions. It's unique.
Extraordinary.
And seeing it from space must just be that next level of wonderment.
Absolutely. Because someone said to me, oh, that might be just like looking out the aeroplane window. And I said, well, no, because you actually never look out an aeroplane window and see the Earth in its entirety.
The ball that
as the ball that it is, which you would see from obviously up in space. Oh no, it's really, yes. I love just that this glass window was such a sort of magnet to them. And they write about beauty a lot, as I've just said, and I realised how hard it is to write about colours, because they write about colours a lot. And to get that difference, you know, in colours is quite tricky, I think, with using words. You know, using a paintbrush is probably much easier. But when you're actually trying to describe it, and that's where that journaling is so immensely helpful to students learning to write and learning to use, language and poetic devices. I've also just been reading Stoneyard Devotional, and a friend just gave me an orchid, and they're very long stalks, and then right on the top of them there's just these little sort of heads, almost with nuns' hats sort of sticking out. And I've had them beside my bed and looking at them, and they just sort of became, because there's nuns, other characters in the book, sort of walking along sort of pathways, with this very austere sort of little look. And I've sort of like turned these orchids into nuns through my use of through my use of language and description. Yes. Which is in writing, which is such a nice thing to be able to do, to be able to do that sort of visualization and transference and see those sorts of things.
Well, I find it so interesting to reflect on what our language can offer us and and its limits. You know, when I'm just trying to describe what I'm hearing, what I'm feeling, what I'm smelling, it's really hard sometimes to say, you know, I'll try and describe the taste of chocolate or the taste of a sage leaf. And it always sort of come back to the same few words. But the beauty of exploring literature and the way that like really top quality writers can write is that sometimes they'll use a phrase to describe something and it's totally off the wall or something you wouldn't think of, or the use of simile or metaphor, and they liken it to something else, and you think, oh, they've just got it. And sometimes there's a phrase and it just like gives you goosebumps or it makes your soul jiggle in a beautiful way or something.
Absolutely. Yes. But just sort of too, I just went off on a little tangent too, thinking about another interesting book is called Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit. And it's really a study of George Orwell. And he's a really interesting person in that, you know, he obviously wrote about the most shocking coercive control of a government and cruelty when you think about 1984, for instance. But he also, you know, in his life absolutely loved gardening and roses and vegetables. He was an avid vegetable gardener as well as roses. And some of those at Wallington where he lives, I haven't been to England since I read that book, but if I went now, I would go because his roses and some of his garden has still been kept in this little town in Wallington where he lived with his wife. So he was able to, I always find that quite interesting, to be able to write, you know, such sort of like disturbing sort of content, which was a warning to the world. but also he had this deeply sensitive side to him about nature, which, does come through a little bit in Animal Farm and in his writing. There are bits and pieces in 1984 which does show that, but yes, it's an interesting kind of dichotomy of these two, the duality of human nature. I think he certainly, was an interesting character, not always probably the nicest person, the easiest person in the world to get along with, but certainly his love for nature is very, it's very strong.
I'm thinking about, for me, when I go out into nature and especially the garden, any nature experiences, I often feel like I learn about myself from watching nature, and it could be like seeing the beauty of an aging flower, for example, has taught me about my own aging. Yeah. Things like that, just little things that you see out there that you find beautiful or interesting that you can turn inwards. Yeah. And it is the same with reading literature. Yeah. Like you look at, we talked about story and sort of diving in or immersing yourself in someone else's story. But often that experience is beautiful and important, and, we go back to literature and reading and immersing ourselves in fictional stories because we can take something out of it that we carry as a lesson.
Absolutely.
Tell me about lessons from literature or that feeling that we can, and in the same way as nature teaches us things that you can learn, things that you can then carry with you from reading.
I just love the way, though, that you just use the idea of an aging flower. I'm thinking of maybe a big sort of floppy sort of maybe camellia or something that's starting to wrinkle up, and the aging process is happening, and how you can relate that to yourself and learn about yourself and sort of see that there's absolutely beauty in that, and it's part of a process, it's part of that is inevitable. So I think I love that you said that you can just go out and just a very simple sort of like experience of connection like that can actually open up a lot of lessons.
Yeah, and you talked about cycles before in the Indigenous way of writing and viewing the world.
Yeah.
I mean, nature is all cycles in every way.
Absolutely.
And it's hard for us because we think of it like a line, our life as a line, I guess, but it is a cycle.
It is actually a cycle. Yeah. No, it is totally. So, no, I just think I very, I suppose I'm quite not a guarded reader, but when I read a book, usually, not always, and this sounds a little bit inflexible maybe, but I usually read a review of it, or I know something about it.
Yep.
I know the author maybe, and I've enjoyed something else or read something else about them, I don't generally just read a book because it's won an award, but that might be part of why I might be attracted to it. Word of mouth, all of that, friends talking about it, book clubs and things like that. So I often, know something about a book before I read it. But I think that, I've learnt so many lessons.
Because you've been reading, like you said, right from the start, reading was a big part of your childhood and sort of family experience, and then growing into a teacher and a reader for your work. I mean, life is punctuated by, like, the two books we talked about have profoundly changed the way I live and the way I view life. But your whole life must be punctuated by these lessons drawn from books.
Yeah, no, it is, because another book that really stuck with me from our little book club, experience, was Silas Marner as well. And that idea of, the gold, how it became so important to replace love with something material, but of course in the end realises that's not the case. That's not what life's all about. But no, I think, good literature, and that's a little bit of a loaded phrase maybe, but it is full, and also how you obviously come, how you respond to it, and how you it's full of redemptive sort of lessons and understanding of yourself. Another writer that I'm very fond of just at the moment is Elizabeth Strout. She's an American writer, and she tells stories about her families and people who live in Maine, in America. And it's more than a trilogy now. I think there's probably 5 or 6. But she just tells stories and doesn't actually imbue them with a lot of meaning at the time. But it's with reflection later, you read it and go, oh, it opens up like a flower. Yeah. It sort of just opens up, and I just suddenly get what that was about. Yeah. And it's kind of like about maybe nothing almost, but it's not. It's really quite powerful.
That's actually, now you're talking lovely. Like that.
Yeah.
I love talking to you about this because it's the same as talking to someone who sees nature in the same way, but you see stories, human stories, in this beautiful way that's so exciting. And I know that we have the same experience of books where you read something and then, I mean, half the experience of reading it is just like the steeping yourself in it and coming back to it again and again in your mind afterwards, like making meaning, making the meaning yourself on reflection.
Absolutely, finding it for yourself. And often that's part of their reading experience. Yeah. And I think that, I have heard some people sometimes say, I'm a bit of a lazy reader. Okay. I'm not sure it's totally what they mean. Maybe that they just sort of read on a surface level and perhaps don't want to dive under. Yeah. But I think that there is effort still involved in reading, which is part of the beauty of it, that you do make sense of it and you do think about it, and it is a reflective exercise. And it is something to discuss. I think, I think book clubs and literature classes and English classes that delve into literature and issues from all sorts of other cultures. Also, just how do young girls know about what's happening really in Afghanistan or Iran?
Reading Lolita and Tehran was one of the ones we read for book club, I think. Yes,
and it's so helpful, that's where young people can just learn so much. Yeah. And I know they've got maybe television or whatever, but I just think reading is just still another. Yeah. It just gives another layer to it, and it's something that stays with you perhaps more. I don't know, that might not be the case with everybody, but I think reading about other cultures, other worlds, other people opens you up to compassion, about empathy. That just develops all of those, just right, obviously from a very young age, those sorts of stories, even going right back to my grandparents, going back to early days in New Zealand. We used to read, particularly, I have this memory of Christmas reading, but because that's perhaps when they came and stayed with us, or we went and stayed with them, but reading Dickens, and that. And I would have been quite young, but I was very taken with Dickens at a young age, And then years later you're reading books like Demon Copperhead and it starts coming back, and you're just realising, those days of David Copperfield, the abuse of children, and then what's happening now in America. It all starts to link together in such a sort of cohesive way about the human condition that is amazing.
Maybe also the way history repeats and
absolutely.
We need to learn lessons.
What are we doing? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I always find in a nature journaling session that the richest part is when you are talking about your journal page or what you noticed with someone else. And now that we're talking, I realise also that was just such a rich part of, especially talking to you, because you have such a deep way of thinking about these things and communicating them. But in the book club, the experience of talking really deepened my appreciation and understanding of something. And it was that exchange afterwards that really helped dive in. Yes.
And sometimes you don't really kind of that, because there's so many layers to journaling, because you're doing your drawing, you're doing your writing, but then you're also articulating when you're doing that sharing. Yeah. And that's a really important part of the process as well, that you are able to share in language verbally, because lots of people find that quite difficult. You'll find lots of students that's one of the public speaking or something like that is one of the things that students are very reluctant to do often.
Yes.
And you have to really create an environment where they feel safe, that they can.
Engaging space.
That they can do that. So that articulation is just a very important part as well. I think.
Something about that's come up for me, which I'm really interested in your idea of, or your thoughts on what is it, when a writer experiences a landscape, or we're talking about love, what is it that you get? What am I trying to say? What's the human need to write that down or to put it down as a picture? There's some sort of powerful thing, a powerful urge that comes over us that we writing it and communicating it, somehow put it in the package and be able to share it with someone. What is that? What is the power of that?
Yeah. I mean, it, on one level, it powers a whole publishing industry. Then on another level, it's, it just can be very just highly personal, just writing
it pack
like
for some. But it is an urge to capture a love or an experience and to share it in that way. It seems so beautifully human.
And so ancient. I think storytelling, if you're going back to all the indigenous cultures, with those that got a spoken record of their stories before a written one normally. So no, I just think it's part of the human condition that we want to communicate, we want to share, we want to talk. Yeah, I mean, if we hadn't done that, imagine our society. I can't quite imagine how that would.
Well, I think in human evolution, that communication and just like the development of verbal of language and all that, it comes out of this need to share with each other.
I think, because that's something. It's a great equalizer. Everybody has a story. No one's in a vacuum. No one's sort of like doesn't have anything. You've got a story. Where you came from, what you came from. But even if you don't easily recognise it, it is there.
And when you start to go in, you think, this and this and this. And that's why sometimes people have said to me, will you ever run out of podcast guests? And there's no way, because I can talk to anyone and they have an experience of nature. They have an experience of being human, and everyone has a unique
story. Which is so valuable for people to share. You learn about yourself. You learn about fear. I've just been going through an illness for a couple of years, and I've had to deal with lots of different emotions. Obviously, with that, it's a tough journey, the old chemo trip. And so just learning about probably one of my greatest emotions has been fear. And what will happen to me, what will happen to my family, what will just sort of, there isn't a foreseeable future, which there isn't anyway. We never know what's going to happen. It is a total mystery, really. But yes, but being fearful. So coming to terms with those sorts of feelings and being able to talk about them, which is part of your story, is very, very important mentally, I think, for accepting things, for surrendering things, or not, So sharing feelings is important.
Tell me about, your relationship to the earth and the world and this cycle that we're all on. Some journeys, for whatever reason, get truncated and we're not ready. But we're all on the same cycle. And I think you mentioned connecting, working through fear and using meditation to sort of be present and that sort of thing. I'm really interested in the feeling of that fear, and then also kind of acceptance and coming to a place of I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to say, but like accepting that cycle and how accepting that cycle connects you with nature. Because I mean, we talked before about nature being cycles, and we although we try to hold ourselves apart from it, we're just part of it. We're just part of the cycle.
Absolutely,
I'm interested in your experience of accepting fear, and also how illness sort of connects you with Mother Nature.
With Mother Nature. I think it does very strongly connect you with nature, even if you haven't been perhaps beforehand. It does do that in a lot of cases. I have and it connects you to, when we talk about place, we've been talking about that connection with landscape. So a lot of the time, I've obviously spent a lot of time in bed and in sort of like thinking, reminiscing, what have you. And I do go back to that New Zealand landscape a lot, to those great big wide rivers down in the South Island of New Zealand and my childhood in that garden. And I do go back to that a lot, and other things I've talked about today, the gardens in Europe, gardens, different places. I loved English gardens, and I actually walked part of the Camino as well, and we walked through lots of little French villages, and pretty much every house and a lot of those French villages down that western seaboard had vegetable gardens, and their tomatoes, were like, they were amazing. Yeah. So, and I loved looking over. They were often walled gardens, and I'd be, peering over them.
It glimpse into someone else's experience.
Yeah. So, so gardens were obviously very, very important to their lifestyle as well, and they always had their little markets out on different days in their villages, and they'd all be selling that sharing, that community that nature creates as well. So I go back to, I'm obviously, not trying to be too much just living in memories, but they're very strong and they come back up, and that connection to nature. So I do, I'm not a very good meditator at all. My mind is quite can be quite all over the place. But I do notice that when I do visualizations, and I'll take myself back to a place where I remember that I felt peaceful, or what. It is always in nature. That connection is always there. So I might be, and it might not even be necessarily a landscape that I've even know really, that I'll recognise it. But I might be in a valley. I might be in a little side of river or creek, or on the beach, or just I still have very strong feelings, and I've only visited a few times, but it was with my mother and sister who we had very special times at Stradbroke Island, just off Brisbane here, and I have very strong feelings about the nature, about that landscape there. I can see it, that's something I do take myself to, and it's very comforting for me. So
when you're feeling fear, is that what you try to do?
I try
bring
to
yourself
do.
to something beautiful.
Yeah, and then try to remember the feelings, or think about the feelings I've got while I'm here, which usually, hopefully, are sort of peaceful and relaxing, and I can sort of. But I'm not sort of. It's a sort of weird thing, because you're not really focusing necessarily on the landscape, but the landscape and the mood of the landscape is what takes you into that place. Yeah.
Landscape and feeling are so intimately connected. I know for my mum and for myself, being by the sea is like it. I know for myself and for her that we just kind of put everything down that we've been carrying.
It washes away.
Yeah. I don't know if there's one particular landscape that does that for you, but for me it's the ocean. Is there is there a place that does that, helps you put down what you've been carrying?
I think it's gardens, probably more than anything. See, I can recognise that, but I haven't had, I look at Deb and know how I've seen her in the water so many times, and she's just a water baby. Yeah. She just loves it, and you can almost see.
Yeah, she comes up, and it's a new person.
You can just see she's just, it's whatever was there, it's just ebbed away, and she's just back to being so refreshed, and her energy is always amazing anyway, just incredible. But I would probably say that when I do my visualizations, because I actually do them where I go through doors.
Beautiful. And
the sort of last door, which then my mind's jumping to The Secret Garden, Frances Hodgson Burnett, from when I was really quite pre-teenager probably I read that. But I think it is gardens and swings, and it's quite English in a way. Yeah. I think I'm thinking quite a few English writers, more contemporary, Ian McEwan and people like that, when I think about gardens as well for some reason. And fields, and sort of because I have done a lot of walking in England as well, and Wales. So, walks and gardens, I think, probably more than the ocean, but I still understand that ocean one. And if I have it about anywhere, it is definitely Stradbroke features there, because it's quite, for some reason, It's quite unique. It strikes me somehow. Yeah. Yeah. It's got that wildness about it, but it's also got a calmness about it. It's got that kind of polarity of different feelings. Yeah.
You had the most amazing celebration of your life that it's such a beautiful thing. So it was a celebration for Kate, and all the people who love you came there and spoke, and it was an amazing thing to look at that crowd of people who deeply love you and who you've touched through all the different aspects of your life, family and work and social groups and book clubs and all the different ways that you move through the world. And to have that moment where people come and say, hey, this is the way you touched me is an amazing thing. Thinking back about literature and writing and reading, one thing that struck me about that beautiful celebration was that because there were some past students who got up and spoke utterly eloquently about you and the way you've touched them. And I'm wondering about your experience of that, of being at the center of this beautiful celebration and to see the way that you've touched people. And not only that, but like the way that those students were using words. You know, you taught them that. You taught them to speak and to be passionate about those things.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
I guess they had this. They had the seeds were there and ripe. But yes, it was a really quite a wonderful experience, and came out of this idea that yes, because I had left school so suddenly, with a diagnosis that was so unexpected and traumatic, that I hadn't really ever sort of said goodbye. Yes, it was a strange time, obviously. So, and I had also, you know, my diagnosis was quite bleak, and I had actually had quite good health for quite a long time. So we thought, no, let's have a bit of a celebration for all the birthdays and the leaving school and my career and what have you. So it was a very special day, and it was lovely how everyone spoke, the teachers as well, about my teaching and students, and how also they actually sort of used a lot of meaning from a lot of the literary works that we had. They'd incorporated that into the speech that we'd share. So like thinking of Robert Frost, particularly The Road Not Taken, one of the teachers did a lovely speech using that. And also, I remember once we were in class and the kids said to me, we talked about death a lot, because death is very prevalent in literature. There's hardly a book that you're going to deal with that doesn't have death in it. So we were talking about death, and they said to me, Miss, if you were going to have a headstone, what would you write on it? And I said, I think I'd probably write, which is the last two lines of Wordsworth's Daffodils, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. And they actually wrote this up on a headstone and put it up on my wall. This was way before I was ill. Yes. But I always liked. I you know, like talking about nature poets. My goodness, Wordsworth, what an incredible person to, you know, the writing that he does about nature is absolutely beautiful, and daffodils, you know, I wandered lonely as a cloud. I just love that. And yes, and another teacher had used the whole gold and the daffodils, and you know, yes, as a lovely sort of framework for their speech as well. So it was lovely to have that sort of, I don't know, affirmation of sort of like that love of they were remembering, like we've remembered books from our book club. They were remembering things from...
And a shared love of Shakespeare. There was someone who spoke about Shakespeare.
King Lear, particularly. Yes, one of the people at the end said, I'm going home to read King Lear. Because a few people had missed, because that is one of my favourite Shakespeares. But, going back to, that day, it was a lovely bringing together of so many of the influences, obviously, and stories. You know, we told a lot of stories, and other people's stories cross-roaded into that, you know, as they always do when you've got that kind of, you've got close connections, which was just lovely. It was a lovely day of sharing. And, you know, there were people there from, you know, babies to 85 who had all shared in some way some of the experiences that we were all talking about. But no, and it was lovely to just hear too. There's lots of humour in it as well, and that comes back to really when I was talking about my joy of teaching, and not to say I never took it serious. I took it absolutely seriously, but I also loved it so much. I can't really ever explain how much I loved it, and I know where those sources of that great love came, and I've talked about quite a lot of them today, but it even still, I'm quite amazed.
Yeah.
It's such a deep love that I have that it's just quite, it quite blows me away.
Yeah, I'm thinking now about part of nature journaling for me is this amazing thing that you can pay attention to the tiniest garden for a lifetime, and you'll never expend. You'll never know it all. You'll never
cover it all. Yeah.
It's the same with literature. Yeah. It's an ever expanding thing that you can dive into forever and never get to the end or the bottom.
That's right. Which makes it sort of part of that mystery of life.
Yeah.
Which is and makes it so much more interesting that you want to just go further. You want to, I can understand people wanting to, the hikers and the people climbing mountains and the people doing, even the cosmonauts or the astronauts on which is a grueling training, and they've sort of built this thing up to be an astronaut as being like almost the king of America. It's a wonderful experience, but actually when you're reading about what they go through,
it's harsh.
It's harsh. It's very, very harsh. But obviously, what they get out of it too is, and just watching the world every day or the planet Earth every day is a bit like being in a garden, and just brings some new experiences the whole time that they're looking at, which is amazing. But and it's like the weather with like obviously. We just this morning were sitting out the back and had an incredible sun shower that just poured out of nowhere with the sun shining. Wonderful. Yeah. Absolutely wonderful.
Noticing those things. Do you know, I'm thinking about the celebration of your life, and the thing that came up so many times, and it's something that I've experienced with you, and I've talked to my sister about about this trait, which is that when you talk to someone, you pay full attention and you make that person feel like they're the only thing that exists, and you just fully are present and attentive. Yeah. And it's just, I've just realized, I've always known that about you and my experience of you, and that's such a beautiful thing to be around. Yeah. But I've just made the connection that's exactly what we're doing when we're paying attention to nature. Yeah. Yeah. Or paying attention to literature or diving in that way. Yeah. Yeah. It's beautiful to realize that thing I love about being near you is that feeling of giving and receiving one's full attention. Yeah. And that's what you bring to the world when paying attention to, like, noticing the little details in nature. Yeah. Or, like I said, in the world of books.
Oh, thank you, B. I mean, that's how I would always hope to be, and I don't know that I always am, but it's something definitely that I not consciously have to aim for, because it does, I do feel naturally that it does come to me quite easily, but it is something, it is an engagement that I think is really powerful and memorable and something, I don't know, I love to hold on to lots of things and think about them, and if I go to a film, which is another media that I love as well, I love to think about them and look at links and connections and why that person might have done that, said that, you know, and realising, no, that person said that because they didn't understand. They're very young. They were very confused at the time, and that's how you develop sort of empathy for people, to understand why miscommunication might happen or estrangement might happen, or and if you don't sort of ever think about those things, you don't really kind of, you can't really connect often with, you're cutting yourself from a lot of connection and powerful sort of communication. Yeah.
For me, and it comes back, all of nature journaling comes back to attention and curiosity. Yeah. And that's the same as relating to other humans. Beings. Yeah. Attention and curiosity. When we're open and present, so much can happen in between people. And I feel like that's a real strength of yours is curiosity, like just sitting with someone and being ready and asking questions.
Yeah.
And
I love that idea of questions too, of conversing, because sometimes people can just tell a story, which is lovely too, and there's an absolute role for that. Yeah. But sometimes conversing is important too, that it becomes more of a two-way story. There's a very important place for that as well.
And in teaching, I imagine that asking questions is an important part of it.
Absolutely. And the way you ask them and just being able to bring out that information from people who might not want to or find it difficult to articulate and all of those, does involve some skills, which obviously teachers do hopefully develop. Yeah. But it just is that, it is so, it is just that thing we were just talking about, like you say, nature journaling, about that, and nature and curiosity and wonder. It's all so connected. The human,
the human experience.
And the human experience and the nature experience or natural experience are so connected.
Yeah.
And I don't think, you can have, ideally you have one with the other. Yeah.
I think we're so intimately connected with nature, even if someone is working in an office and watching TV at night and just sort of being in their own human bubble. I think there's something in us that's just connected.
Yes.
We can't sever it.
No. I think that umbilical cord sort of does stretch to several points. Yeah.
And even just the way we are together as humans.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's all so complex, isn't it? So,
yes.
And thinking and talking about fear.
Yeah.
I mean, fear for me was a really big part of my childhood. I felt fearful a lot of the time and just so confused about like being a human being. For me, that has always been something a little bit scary. And as the more I grow up, the more I spend time in nature and sort of immerse myself in the idea of that cycle, the less fear I have. But I always felt a little out of place, like, what am I doing here? Look at me, I'm a human being. And that was always something quite odd to me.
Yeah. That was your curiosity though, because I remember you were keen on, remember when you were keen on Boy George?
Love that you know that about me.
No, various things. And it is about, when you're younger, you're looking at different identities and different people and different, you're trying things out. And I think that's part of the curiosity. And I think that's part of what, also led you to having this absolutely incredible, deeply wonderful, curious way of looking at the world through nature journaling, which shouldn't be unusual, but there is a uniqueness about it, that awareness. It is, but it's becoming, through people like you and your international journaling and weeks and things like that, it's just becoming amazing.
It's growing, isn't it?
It's growing, and people are responding to it in such a positive way. It's wonderful.
Yeah. I wonder if it's, this happens in all areas of life, I think, but like the pendulum swings one way and then it swings again the other way. And I wonder if, we kind of get saturated with technology and AI and this whole thing, and now people are like, actually, that doesn't make me feel the way I want to feel, and it's swinging back. Yeah. Because it is about feeling. It is about a way of being in the world that's different from sort of numbing with technology and screens and stuff.
And that's a really good word to use, isn't it? Numbing, because that's what it's about. Too much, obviously, technology and gaming or whatever they're doing is about numbing, masking, those sorts of things.
And sometimes like being in nature, and I keep going, I don't know why I'm returning to this word, but fear. I mean, there's some things that we don't want to feel, and so it's natural to want to numb that. And it's easy to numb that now that we've got like this tool at our fingertips, literally, that we can sort of blot out those, okay, I feel this big thing. I don't want to feel that, so I won't. Whereas feeling it and going through it and sort of being curious about our own feelings as well is another thing. Like, oh, I'm feeling fear. What is that? Or, oh, I'm feeling lonely or bored or static or confused or lost or whatever those feelings are we don't want to feel. Just sort of being curious about that is a whole nother way of being in the world as well. Just going, okay, this is interesting, and then just feeling it. And I find for myself that they don't last very long. It doesn't last.
No.
You can sort of, if you go balance into it, you go through it.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas if you're sort of holding and numbing and
resisting,
it's it stays longer when I try to blot it out than if I dive into it with curiosity.
So that curiosity is very helpful, really, to help you. It is such a strange, and it is kind of like a balance, because I will still go through periods of time, because I've been ill almost 3 years now, and I can still go through periods of time where I am quite fearful, and I'll have quite a lot of tears, and I can get really sort of go down the rabbit hole. But there are a lot of other times, and probably more than there used to be as time has gone by, where I have become much more curious and accepting about that curiosity, and realising too that this is part of life. That's sort of probably surrender, but not surrender in as much as I'm giving up,
like a waving a white flag, but more like letting the wave
take me, and just letting, where's this going to take me? I'll go with it. But it is such a big mystery too. That and I've done a lot of reading around near-death experiences, around Buddhist experiences, about lots of things to do with cancer cures and all sorts of things. So, which in some ways can make you a little bit more fearful or less fearful. But in the end, it comes down to, even the near-death experiences, people are still only talking about really just after death, maybe the white light or seeing people, but it's not like what happens, even the next step, or even like following science about what happens to the body or what happens. So it's still a very big mystery that it's which has elements of fear for me,
of course,
and elements of curiosity strongly.
I remember when I was a kid, when you're a kid you think that your parents know everything. And I remember asking my brother what happens when you die, and he said nobody knows. And I remember saying, well, Mum will know. And I remember going to Mum. I was like, well, Mum will know. And I went to her and I said, Mum, what happens after you die? And she said, nobody really knows. And I remember that as a big moment. Like, hang on, wait. There's this intense mystery that happens to everyone, including Mum, including myself, including everybody I have ever known. And yet we don't know what it is. It's like I remember that
it's
being
quite astounding, really,
it's
isn't it?
astonishing.
When we know so much.
Yes.
But in actual fact, we know so little.
Yes.
I know. That's so struck me about you, Bea, that even at a very young age, you would be asking a question like that. Because that was very much you. You were that curiosity about those sorts of questions. You asked at a very young age, actually.
I used to lie in bed at night time and just ruminate. And I was a worrier. Less so as I get older, but I do remember worrying a lot and thinking about big picture stuff.
But I think, I think that you've always, and I think that what has also, that does lead to what you've gone into with your nature journaling, and it leads to also to the reading and love of literature and love of another person's story and all of that. I think that curiosity too, it's an important word.
It's beautiful to talk to you and to connect literature, writing and reading. I mean, those are two sides of the same coin, but both such rich experiences.
Yes.
And nature. Those things together, it's beautiful. And not only that, but also like the way you are as a human being and the way that you interact with people and how that makes people feel. It's been such a beautiful thing to chat to you today. Thank you for being on the podcast with me.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And I know later on I'll be going, we didn't mention that. I should have said that book. I should have. But no, it's perfect the way it is. When the things we've said, I feel really joyful. Absolutely about it too. So that's the main thing. Thank you, Bea.
Thank you.
I love you.
I love you too. That was so good. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with our precious Kate. I'm so grateful to have had the chance to capture this conversation. She was well on the day we recorded, really well and engaged and joyful. And it's such a precious thing to have her words and to be able to revisit her voice and the little things that she'd say in our conversations, always finishing the last word of the sentence of the person she was talking to as a way of being fully engaged and affirming that she was right there with you. I will treasure this conversation forever, and I'm really grateful to have had the chance to share it with you too. We talked about the Celebrate Kate event that was held a few months ago. That celebration was filmed at the time, and the link to where you can watch that video is in the show notes of this episode. In the show notes, I've also included a list of the wonderful books that Kate mentioned that have been important to her and her understanding of landscape and literature. Thank you so much for listening to this super special episode. See you next week.